Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. We are very happy to have you here today, this afternoon. On behalf of the Gamini Korea Foundation, I would like to warmly welcome you for the 18th session on ethnicity and development in Sri Lanka. So we've been having these sessions for the past few months, and this has come to the 18th session of the Sri Lanka Innovators Forum roundtable sessions that we've been conducting. And today our session will be conducted by Professor Kalinga Tudor Silva. Professor Kalinga Silva is eminent sociologist, renowned in his distinguished career spanning over 4 decades. He held key positions including senior professorship at the University of Peradeniya, Sri Lanka, and served as a visiting professor at institutes such as Whittier College and Bowdoin College in USA. His academic journey included a BA Honours in Sociology from the University of Peradeniya and a PhD from Monash University, Australia. Professor Silva has notable achievements include spearheading significant projects like the IRQUE proposal and receiving prestigious awards such as the Fulbright Senior Scholar Award. His legacy embodies excellence in academia and international collaboration. So Professor Kalinga Tudor Silva will be doing the presentation on his paper today. And our session chair will be none other than Professor Siri Hettige, Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Colombo and Adjunct Professor at RMIT University, Melbourne, Australia. Professor Siri Hettige specializes in sociology. And our panelists will be none other than Dr. Radhika Kumaraswamy, a lawyer, a diplomat, a human rights advocate who has served as a former Undersecretary Undersecretary General of the United Nations Special Representative for Children and Armed Conflict, and also Professor Dhammika Herath, Department of Sociology, University of Peradeniya, and Professor Priyan Senemiratne, Technical Specialist, Reconciliation and Peace Building Inclusive Governance Team, United Nations Development Program, and Dr. Mario Gomez, Executive Director of International Center for Ethnic Studies, Sri Lanka. We are very happy to have you here and we warmly welcome you today. Before we commence our proceedings, I would like to play a small video about the Sri Lankan Innovators Forum and what it is all about. I hope you enjoy it.
The Sri Lanka Innovators Forum, SLIF, is an initiative of the Gamini Korea Foundation aimed at meaningfully contributing towards resolving the complex economic issues confronting the country today. The Gamini Korea Foundation was founded to take forward the passion of Dr. Gamini Korea to achieve just and equitable economic development in all countries. The late Dr. Gamini Korea was an internationally renowned Sri Lankan economist and an outstanding product of the universities of Cambridge and Oxford. Born on the 4th of November 1925 to Dr. C.V.S. Korea and Freda Korea, sister of Sir John Kotalavala, the then Prime Minister of Ceylon. Dr. Gamini Korea's grandfather and granduncle were the famous freedom fighters from Chilo, Victor Korea, who was a member of the Legislative Council of Ceylon, and Charles Korea. His uncle, Sir Claude Korea, was at the forefront of Sri Lanka's entry onto the world stage at the independence and for many years thereafter. Gamini Korea was educated at the Royal College Colombo, after which he started his higher education at the University of Ceylon in 1944, before going to study at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, and Nuffield College, Oxford from 1945 to 52. There he obtained 2 BAs and MAs from the University of Oxford and the University of Cambridge and a DPhil from University of Oxford. He was the first Sri Lankan to obtain a doctorate in economics. He was also the first Sri Lankan to obtain a doctorate from Oxford University in any subject. He was a key member of the Planning Committee for Sri Lanka's first 10-year plan, 1959, which sought to raise economic growth and reduce poverty. Among his numerous achievements was his appointment as the Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, where he negotiated the terms of the Loam Convention, a landmark agreement providing development and access to European markets to Africa and the Caribbean. He was an early proponent of the equitable development who worked tirelessly for trade and development in developing countries. The Gamini Korea Foundation provides opportunities for meaningful economic engagement through rigorous multidisciplinary research to promote inclusive and sustainable development. The Gamini Korea Foundation, an autonomous non-profit institution, is committed to making a real and lasting difference in the lives of vulnerable people. The Sri Lanka Innovators Forum, SLIF, has been conceptualized by Gamini Korea Foundation to bring about change and infuse innovation into the processes of democratic governance and sustainable economic development. It aims to pursue in-depth research and dialogue, focusing on core sectors that need to be addressed and suggest innovative, results-oriented policy strategies to resolve the current economic crisis. The Sri Lanka Innovators Forum will bring together the like-minded thought leaders and industry stakeholders to discuss, debate and agree on pressing issues in a variety of sectors and divide the issues papers and provide necessary guidance and relevant research material to the respective authors. SLIF will transcend boundaries and barriers and invite specialists from all over the world to contribute their expert views and knowledge to enable Sri Lanka to face its current challenges effectively. 20 identified sectors have been assigned to experts to research and write issues papers on contemporary issues which have an impact on socio-economic development. The discourse will commence with questions that should be raised on good governance and administrative reforms. The other topics are tourism, export-oriented industrial development, macroeconomic policy, poverty reduction, reforming Sri Lanka's state-oriented enterprises, Sri Lanka's electricity and petroleum industry, Sri Lankan food crops, livestock and fisheries, transportation and highways, education, healthcare, shipping and logistics, international trade and investment, subnational policies, environment, women and development, ethnicity and socio-economic development, information technology and foreign policy. The outcome of these issues papers forms a blueprint to be presented to policymakers as a landmark contribution from the Gamini Korea Foundation towards strengthening the economic recovery of Sri Lanka. You are invited to join the Sri Lanka Innovators Forum by logging on to the Gamini Korea website. Fill in the registration form, choose an area of expertise where you would like to share your knowledge, advice and comments on the issues papers posted under each thematic area. Sri Lanka Innovators Forum, beyond the barriers of tradition.
Thank you very much. Now I have the honor and privilege of inviting Dr. Lloyd Fernando, Chairman of the Gamini Korea Foundation, to give the welcome speech. Dr. Lloyd, over to you.
Thank you, Sohan. I'm privileged to address you at this moment because my colleague, the Deputy Chairman, Mr. Dr. Harsha Atrupana, normally plays this role. But I see a very distinguished audience here, and I look forward to a very good discussion on a subject which is equally difficult. I mean, people have been talking about this for so many years. We have not found a proper solution. Well, that's my view. Maybe some people think that we have found a solution. So that is also something to be discussed. But I have a good audience, a good set of panelists, and also all the others who are actually invited to speak on the subject. I don't want to talk too much because you know what we are trying to do at the Gamini Korea Foundation. And we have covered already 18 subjects which were subjected to, scrutiny by experts and then presented at meetings like these. And then we are putting all those things together so that we send them to our diaspora organizations. So we have a fairly good, strong diaspora groups, and we would like to know their views. Now, this particular subject is something that will interest them the most, and they'll be able to share with us some knowledge. And when those come back to us, we will share them with you. Anyway, without taking too much of your time, let me now ask Sohan to get the meeting going.
Thank you, Dr. Lloyd. Without taking much of your time, I would like to now invite Professor Kalinga Tudor de Silva to present his paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank the organizers and also Professor Kolomagi, I think, played an important role in connecting me to this network. Some time ago, he sent me an email saying that I have to, whether I would be interested in writing a paper or working paper on ethnicity and development. I wasn't sure whether I am the best person to do this paper for a number of reasons, but without taking too much time, I agreed to do this. Actually, people in Sri Lanka, everybody has some opinion about ethnicity. Often a fixed opinion. They don't want to debate. It's deep in their hearts. So sometimes it is difficult to talk about it. Some people tend to think that not talking about ethnicity is the best policy, best way to deal with ethnicity, because whatever you say can be misinterpreted. So that is why I was a little bit reluctant when Professor Kolomagi initially invited me. But anyway, I think this is a very important time to talk about this issue because, we have lived with ethnic troubles, ethnically induced war, and many other kind of forms of ethnic tension. I think we need to discuss about it and try to understand what are the best ways to deal with this problem. Actually, my presentation will be very brief, and I want to open up a few issues for discussion, and I believe the panelists will take on some aspects of this. Let me first lay out my main argument in this presentation. My main argument is that ethnicity can be a development facilitator or a development blocker depending on the way state and political system handle ethnicity. So there is no kind of fixed position about ethnicity. Ethnicity is good or bad is not what I'm going to say. Basically what I'm going to discuss is why ethnicity has become a significant development blocker in the Sri Lankan context. In Sri Lanka, ethnicity has been a development blocker for the most part because political leaders, the state and state policies have mishandled it, and in some instances weaponized ethnicity for their own benefits. So that I see as the primary problem we have to deal with. And how, especially if you are trying to understand, how to make ethnicity a potential development facilitator, we have to deal with this particular issue. Our challenge is how to convert ethnicity from a development blocker to a development facilitator, in my view. So I'm going to share some basic ideas about how I propose to do this. Global patterns and processes. Actually, there has been quite a bit of literature on ethnicity and development globally. Focus was on Africa, and especially people like Easterly and Levine, way back in 1997. Basically argued that ethnic diversity is bad for development by very nature. Ethnic diversity, when there are too many ethnic groups, especially fighting with each other in a country, it makes it very difficult for the country to progress. And they actually did the kind of survey of many countries in Africa, and they argued that countries that have the highest degree of ethnic diversity are the ones which have the lowest rate of growth. So this is the work of Easterly and Levine, and subsequently this argument has been questioned by many people, and I will refer to some of the arguments. But some of the more interesting work on ethnicity and development actually has come from the so-called Asian tiger nations, particularly Taiwan and South Korea, which are more or less ethnically uniform, largely ethnically uniform. If you take South Korea, I think about 95% of the population belong to one ethnic group, and the others are very small. Similarly in Taiwan. And in those two countries, ethnicity has actually been mobilized by the rulers, particularly in the case of South Korea, under a kind of military dictatorship. They have mobilized ethnicity to move people to action, and to make them work hard, to make them really, work hard for the country. So that is often presented as a good example of mobilization of ethnicity for development, but it also had its own problems, which I will refer to a little later. And in Evans' research, he tried to highlight that there is an alliance between industrializing elites and meritocratic bureaucracy, rule-bound bureaucracy, particularly in the case of Taiwan, and that facilitated, basically that pushed the political leadership to, basically think about the future, not so much to spend too much resources to satisfy their current needs, but to sacrifice some of their resources for future use. And that was possible because they are ethnically uniform countries, and there was a kind of powerful political leadership, and that worked, particularly in the case of Taiwan. Tough decisions with short-term costs and long-term benefits were possible given this ethnic scenario. But there is also some interesting work by someone called Kohli, Indian social scientist, comparing different countries using the so-called state-driven development approaches, particularly countries like Brazil, Nigeria, and South Korea, to find out how it has worked or not worked. He, of course, argued that state-driven development has actually worked satisfactorily in South Korea, but not so satisfactorily in Nigeria and Brazil, partly because in the case of Brazil, trade unions were demanding and too much, and they could not think about the future. They had to basically cater to this present issues. And in the case of Nigeria, it was ethnic groups, fighting each other, putting pressure on the state to satisfy their needs. So neither in the case of Nigeria nor in the case of Brazil, development could proceed in the way anticipated because of this scenario. And if you take Sri Lanka, perhaps there's an interesting parallel here, because in the case of Sri Lanka, ethnic groups are putting pressure on the government, but trade unions are also doing the same thing. So we are almost, at multiple pressures. So that may partly explains development not doing well in the Sri Lankan case, but this is again something that I might come back to a little later. Let me first introduce the key concepts, ethnicity. What I mean by ethnicity, of course, it has multiple meanings. What I mean by ethnicity is a group identification derived from shared history, common culture, and the idea of common origin. A group identification derived from shared history, common culture, maybe something like language or religion or combination of both, and idea of common origin. But what is perhaps more important, more relevant when we look at the development issues is not so much ethnicity, but what is called ethno-nationalism, a hegemonic or anti-hegemonic ideology that drives political action, policy formulation, and mass mobilization with ethnic identity and concerns as a key driving force. So ethno-nationalism refers to mobilization of ethnicity for nation building and for political purposes, okay, and for various other purposes. Before I get into my main argument, I want to make a few caveats. Firstly, I do not want to reduce underdevelopment to a single factor like ethnicity. We know underdevelopment is connected to many other factors, resources, and colonial history, and many other factors. Ethnicity is only one factor. Perhaps it's an important factor in particular situations. And I do not see ethnicity as a primordial entity of static nature, something which is given by history. It evolves, okay? It's a changing situation. So when we look at the role of ethnicity, we need to understand that we are dealing with a constantly changing phenomenon, and how this change affects its impact is important. Ethnicity's entanglement with development or underdevelopment has a lot to do with politicization of ethnicity. So this is what we are trying to understand when we try to unpack how ethnicity impact on development. How has ethnicity served as a development blocker, particularly in our situation? I already said that in my view, ethnicity has been a development blocker rather than a development facilitator. And why this is so and how this has happened, I think we need to look at. One point I want to make is that ethnicity has inflicted all systems and contaminated them in ways that inhibit productive, efficient engagement. When I say all systems, ethnicity has inflicted political parties, religions, private sector to some extent, and education system, and so it has, it's like a virus, so it has actually contaminated a lot of systems and make it very difficult for systems to work in whatever way you want to make it work. Secondly, ethnicity has also contaminated the public mindset so as to produce, so as to prejudice their attitudes, undermine the incentive system, and trigger violent extremism in some cases. So it not only it has inflicted systems, it has inflicted the psyche of people in different communities. And once it is in you, it's very difficult for you to get out of it, because you try to explain everything using the idea of ethnicity. But one of the things that I want to bring out in this presentation is ethnic violence has damaged economic activities, promoted what I call predatory behavior, and undermined rational economic processes conducive to development. So not only it has affected systems, it has affected the way people work, way people think, and I think that produces long-term impacts. Symptoms of problematic ethnic mindset, I have, these are very basic ideas, my own impressions. The idea that we are poor and underdevelopment because of actions and appropriations by ethnic others. So some people tend to think whatever problems they have, could be unemployment, it could be lack of educational facilities, it could be poverty. This is not because of anything that in you, what you do or don't do, but it is because of some bad thing somebody else has done for you. The perception that the state should be an exclusive guardian or sponsor of one's group, that is another symptom of problematic mindset, that the state does not have to look after everybody equally, but state has a primary responsibility to your own group, and sometimes to your own group only. And also the idea that one group's gains are invariably viewed as loss for the other group. One's failure is caused not so much by one's own action and mistakes, but due to someone else standing in one's way. So there is a kind of tendency to blame others. So there is a blaming syndrome included in especially ethno-nationalist kind of interpretations. And also the tendency to readily accept hate speech without probing, questioning, or verifying, because they are prejudiced. They tend to believe in, if there is something that confirms their prejudices, they don't question. They look at it as truth. I will not talk too much about the impact of the war, because there has been a lot of work, especially by agencies looking at the cost of war and the economic damage caused by the war. Actually, we ourselves did few follow-up studies after the end of the war. Myself and Professor Dhammika Herath, who will be a panelist in this, and we looked at the destruction of two main livelihoods in the northeast provinces during the war, farming and fishing. Farming, because there were restrictions on supply of agrochemicals during the war, because they were being used for making explosives and so on. And fishing, because deep sea fishing was banned, because LTT was using that territory to import weapons and other things from outside. So both of these key economic activities in Northeast were affected. But when you look at the impact of the war on the economy, you have to look at other big time engagements, like the attack on the central bank. Some of you have worked there. And also the attack on the Katunayake airport. Two big events. And they had a big impact on the economy, on tourism, and the trust in systems, and so on and so forth. But what is interesting about the war period is that in spite of these destructions, the economic growth, there was a relatively stable, something like 5% economic growth during this period. Whether this is due to this artifact of the information on growth, or whether this is real, I'm not 100% sure. But anyway, that was something that we still need to understand. But military employment definitely benefited the Sinhala community. Youth in rural areas in particular, like educated youth in the rural areas got employment because of the war. But then high military expenditure by the state maintained even after the end of the war. So this is another kind of paradox. We thought after the end of the war, military expenditure will be reduced, but it didn't happen. So that may also partly explain the underdevelopment in the country. But for the most part, I'm going to share with you the results of one study that I was engaged in with several colleagues from different universities, basically looking at the anti-Muslim violence following the Easter Sunday attack in places like Kuliyapitiya, Nikavaratu. This happened in 2019, I think somewhere in May. Easter attack took place in 2019 April, and the anti-Muslim violence, ethnic riots took place in May, 1 month later. And actually I'm just reproducing a report by a journalist, Piumi Fonseca, on the destruction caused by this violence in different places, number of houses damaged, number of businesses damaged, mosques, vehicles, and bodily harms caused, and so on. But one thing that is evident from her data is that number of businesses attacked or damaged was much higher, 186. So obviously there was a kind of business-related factor, business, maybe business rivalries was kind of a driving force in these attacks. And every ethnic riot results in this kind of massive damage, and we have had 1958, 1977, 1978, 1983, and of course after the end of the war, since 2012, attacks in Digana, places like in the south, and Ampara, and many such places. And nobody has actually done a complete impact of these different riots, on the economy and the livelihoods of people. But I think this also partly explains the destruction caused by these riots over the years. These are some visuals from this post-Easter Sunday violence. One of the things that we investigated is the actually attack on a pasta factory in Minuwangoda during this violence, and I will talk about it in little more detail later. Here's a mosque, and on the in this corner, you can see actually there is one shop which was burned, mostly electronic shop owned by a Muslim person. We talked to him after the event, and he was in a depressed mode, and he lost all his earnings over a long period of time. He tried to get insurance compensation. I think he got it subsequently, but he was not satisfied about the compensation received. So basically his argument was that he has built it over a long period of time, and all his effort was to make it a successful business, and he felt that now he will not touch it again. All he wants to get was his compensation. Key features of ethnic riots: minority businesses are the main target. Full compensation not received. Shop boycott campaigns were part of this. So I already showed you that businesses were targeted, but in addition there were shop boycott campaigns before and after the event. Informal collective blocking of ethnic minorities from land and shop premises happened in certain towns. The political leadership and the traders got together and said, no, nobody else can come into our area, and we will not allow. And there was a kind of understanding that they will not sell property to people from certain communities. And the other important thing is impunity of the attackers. In none of these attacks, people were punished. In some cases they were arrested, but they were released afterwards. Maybe one or two punished, but considering the number of people involved, none of them received serious punishment. So how can it happen in a country where we have a large police force and they are supposed to investigate? Why they didn't do it is something that we need to look at. Total economic damage and long-term impact on development not assessed. Redevelopment is possible, but often it is partial recovery at best and total elimination at worst. And these are some ideas about the shop boycott campaign in Minuangoda area. Campaign started by some Sinhala youth. Social media propaganda was used. Paste notices in Sinhala and Tamil shops. So this is the poster they pasted, basically to identify them as non-Muslim on premise. Okay. Now here this one says Mage Rata, and then there is a lion symbol, and then but this poster was not pasted on any of the Muslim shops. So the customers will identify which shops are Muslim owned and which shops are to be boycotted. Surveillance carried out also in addition. Some young people hang around the places to make sure that Sinhalese customers don't visit any of the Muslim shops. Effective in the first 2-3 months, but then it fizzled out, so the campaign was not successful because people started going back to Muslim shops because they were giving better terms and maybe they had more, the kind of things they wanted to buy. So shop boycott campaign was not really successful. But some businesses, premises closed, but most survived at some level. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this particular pasta factory, not because I have a great deal of attachment to pasta, but this is something that indicates how investments are affected by this kind of attacks. This was a Muslim-owned enterprise established in 2017 in near Minuangoda town. The largest pasta factory in Sri Lanka, according to many reports. Initial investment was about 500 million rupees. And this Muslim owner had worked abroad. All the savings he brought from overseas, he invested, and also he took loans to establish the business. On May 13, 2019, mobs came at night from outside. The staff informed the local police, and a team of 10 officers sent to the site in a jeep. But then the officers said, what can we do? There are 200, 300 rioters. We couldn't do anything. So they just, they didn't do anything to prevent. Okay? And afterwards they went back and reported back to their boss that 10 people cannot control this number of people. So the whole place was gutted, and no one was arrested. The attacker set fire to buildings, stocks and machinery. Estimated damage 700 million. Over 200 workers in the factory, mostly Sinhalese. So the place was owned by a Muslim, but a vast majority of the workforce was Sinhalese. The Sinhala mobs didn't realize that they are causing collateral damage to their own kind, and a lot of people lost their employment as a result. These are, on the left-hand side you have prior to the attack, and factory set on fire. You can see the volume of damage. Key motives of ethnic rights. Of course, there has been many studies of ethnic rights in Sri Lanka, especially Stanley Tambaya's work is quite important in this regard. There are several elements. Ethnic hatred, cultivated through social media. Initially, it was triggered by rumor before social media came, but social media took over and made it much, hatred spread very fast. there was looting. So for the poor people, there was something to gain by riots. Okay, but for the big businesses, grabbing business from other communities, predatory motive was far more important. Economic harm was multiple: loss of capital, loss of faith in systems, disincentive for investment, as in the case of pasta factory, collateral damage, not only the owner but other people, and also backward and forward linkages were destroyed. Every ethnic attack results in a development pushback. This is something that we don't realize. Every attack results in a kind of development pushback, and people who lost their assets have to make a lot of effort to basically restore their enterprises. Many people don't do it. I will probably skip this part. Problematic state policies largely guided by ethno-nationalist sentiments. I think most of you know national language policies, university admission policies, and land settlement policies. Primarily trying to benefit one community against the other, without trying to make sure that these policies have beneficial impacts on everybody, irrespective of their ethnicity. Systemic contamination, also quite significant. I think one of the important things that we can learn from all the ethnic riots, I'm not only talking about violence targeting minorities, but Easter Sunday was a minority led attack on hotels and also churches. So in all these instances, rule of law was undermined. So, people were not arrested, effort were not made to prevent this from happening. We have had a whole history of ethnic riots from 1958 onwards. If you go back to 1915, you can maybe look at it as the starting point. But we haven't learned many lessons about how to prevent this from happening. Now there seems to be a lull, and I hope this lull will be permanent. But generally speaking, our law enforcement authorities and politicians and people who are learn from their experiences. And ethno-nationalism is also used as a cover for advancing and legitimizing private interests. Okay, I told you that ethnicity has can infect systems. So this is one such example. Private interests, using state apparatus to advance private interests. Patronage politics. Neo-patrimonialism is a term that is widely used to describe these informal networks, ethnically driven informal networks, basically taking control, undermining systems, okay? Particularly in African context, but also in other countries. And then violent extremism, how it is connected with extremist ethnic sentiments. There's rent-seeking, predatory practices, sand mining and illicit extraction of timber by people with power is another manifestation of this. This has environmental impacts in addition to developmental impacts. People with power, using their connections, they basically engage in this. Once again, there is no action, and there are people who try to protect them, safeguard them. Cannot progress in business unless backed by powerful political lobbies. There is also a tendency for people in big business to come to politics in a big way. One would think that this is a good development, but in my view, this is not a good development, because that means they can't do business in our country without having political power, and they will misuse political power to develop their businesses. And this is maybe something that the private sector should look at. What can be done to transform ethnicity from a development blocker to a development facilitator? And this is very basic, some basic ideas from my side. I think there has to be a taming of ethnicity. Taming, I use the word very carefully, taming, but not debunking. Ethnicity, I mean, we have to live with it, okay? Ethnicity is part of our existence. But when it becomes out of control and interferes in governance, I think it's bad for the country and bad for development. But one thing that is very important is how to cultivate a more inclusive Sri Lankan identity or Sri Lankan nationalism as an overarching ideology. We are Sri Lankans. Of course, we are Tamils, we are Muslims, we are Sinhalese, we are Burghers. We can have that identity, but that should not be the driving force. What is more important is Sri Lankanness, and I don't see much of this happening in the education system, in mass media, or anywhere else. But I think it's a necessity if we are to get out of this crisis right now. Education system certainly has a role to play. Activate law enforcement machinery and enforce the rule of law. Social science research also has to play a role. And creative art, I think, also has a role to play. What I have done is I have tried to identify a few areas where this can be done, but I am sure panelists will have other ideas as well. So if you take the education system, currently, I mean, we boast of our free education system as the best in the world. Probably it has some very good qualities. We are product of that system. Nevertheless, it has also come with some huge drawbacks. Schools are segregated. School curriculum, textbooks sometimes serve to reproduce prejudices and stereotypes. Perhaps in terms of interventions, how to promote multicultural education, how to bring together children from different communities to some forum, like where they can interact, they can make friends, they can learn from each other, is certainly important. I think some positive developments are happening in this regard right now, but I don't think it is enough. Review curriculum and school textbooks in humanities and social sciences in particular. I'm emphasizing humanities and social sciences because those are the disciplines that we are more familiar with, but these are also the textbooks where history and culture is taught without considering the serious implications. Create platforms for interaction among students from different backgrounds. I already mentioned this. Law enforcement, I think there are a lot to do. Current status, ethno-religious violence ignored or tolerated. Weak minority representation in security forces. I think military is nearly 100% Sinhalese. Maybe there are a few changes recently, but not enough. Multi-ethnic security force is important. Law enforcement streamlined. Maybe some of our panelists can perhaps give more ideas about this aspect. Language competencies of security personnel. I think there is some improvement in this regard, especially Sri Lankan security forces in the northeast. I think some of them have learned Tamil and communicate in Tamil. But I feel that, security forces should represent the population in the country, not one community, so that, people will not feel alienated from security forces, and they will not look at, the armed forces as kind of coming from outside. Legal aid for victims of ethnic violence is also important. Social science research, I think I will leave it to my social science colleagues for the most part. Greater support for peace-building research, trying to understand bottlenecks for peace building, set up interdisciplinary and multi-ethnic team research, student engagement in peace building, create platforms for interaction among students from different ethnicities, strengthen research traditions and in and outside the university system is very important. Creative art, I'm not a specialist in this area, but I know there are some useful interventions right now. Inadequate interaction among artists in Sinhala and Tamil language streams, promote social harmony through creative art, facilitate interethnic collaboration, translation of relevant creative work from one language group to the other, work towards development of a broader Sri Lankan identity that I referred to. Economy, again, I will be very brief here. Current status, interethnic competition and tension in the marketplace. Eliminate predatory activities in the marketplace. Predatory activities where people with power actually play a more important role. Economic development as an inclusive process that broadens opportunities for everyone, irrespective of who they are. State-led enterprises and private enterprises have a role to play. Promote joint businesses and backward and forward linkages among different communities. Activate and facilitate business chambers at local and national level. Basically, get proper business people to share their experiences and work towards social harmony in their areas. Promote social capital within the across ethnicities. So one way to look at ethnicity in a positive manner is to look at it as social capital. You can use ethnic ties, ethnic contacts to do well in businesses. I think this is something that we can look further. How ethnicity can be used to facilitate business development. Other sectors where interventions may be necessary, but where I have not gone into, print and electronic media has a major role to play in terms of creating that inclusive Sri Lankan identity that I referred to. Social media, I think also similarly has a role to play. Social media often promotes hate among communities, much more than positive ideas. Gossip and rumor still plays a role. Role of religious leaders is important, how to make sure that religious leaders don't harm social harmony through their interventions. And another issue is intersectionality between ethnicity and gender. Ethnicity and gender also has a lot of interaction with each other. Especially we realize in the post-Easter Sunday attack, Muslim women wearing their dress code was targeted. They were prevented from traveling in public buses. They were prevented in entering hospitals in some instances. So these are areas where some interventions are definitely needed. So I will stop here. As I said at the beginning, shared with you some basic, very simple ideas with you about how we can possibly work towards making ethnicity not an obstacle to development, but a potential facilitator. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kalinga Tudor Silva. I would like to invite you to take your seat in front, Professor, in order to start the discussion, the panel discussion. And I would also have the privilege and honor of inviting Professor Siri Hettike, Session Chair, to chair the... Ma'am, please take your seat. Professor Dhammika Herath, Dr. Priyan Senaviratnam, and Dr. Mario Gomez. Please take your seats in front. Professor Siri Hettike, over to you, sir.
Okay, let me also begin by thanking the Gamini Korea Foundation for inviting me to chair this session. But I would like to also want to thank the panelists who would naturally, enrich the discussion that we are going to have. I do not want to actually take much time to really provide any kind of background from my side, but I think it would be necessary for us to take a few steps back and to look at, the whole issue from a broader perspective in time and space. I feel that we are not alone in this kind of discussion when you look around the world. In fact, all human societies from time immemorial have been driven by ideas and interests in various combinations. And here, of course, we are talking about, on the one hand, ideologies. Of course, ethno-nationalism is one ideology, but of course, as you can see in Sri Lanka, we have had a range of ideologies guiding the political formation in this country, and also the development trajectory has also been very much driven by some of these ideologies. I don't have to really go into great detail. As you can imagine, we started with a liberal kind of ideological framework, but then quickly it also gave way to ethno-nationalist ideology. And then, of course, we moved on, and we have had social democratic ideas also dominating public discussions, and also the political process, and of course, policy-making process as well. And that, of course, gave way to neoliberalism. And then we had a period of populism dominating our politics and public affairs, and then we are now back to neoliberalism again. So the point is that given the ideological orientation of the regime in power, you will see that regime basically coming out with policies in line with that kind of ideology. So we have seen after independence many public policies that were driven by socialist and social democratic ideas. I don't want to go into any detail, but as you're all familiar with what happened after independence. And then thereafter, of course, public policies were influenced by ethno-nationalism, as Tudor has already looked at, particularly if you take the case of education and also our language policy and so on and so forth. So the point is that you cannot have politics without ideologies. And you cannot have a state without having a particular ideological orientation. Now the question, of course, is how to really manage the nexus between ideology and state formation and state action. I think that is really the kind of larger framework, and I think this is, as Tudor also alluded to, is not confined to Sri Lanka, and depending on the the composition of the population and the composition of the ideological orientation of a particular regime, you will have changing public policies and so on. Public policies in return also have an impact on what happens in not only development but also what happens in the social system and so on and so forth, and also, of course, culture and so on and so forth. So the point is that we have to probably look at this kind of larger picture. So managing, of course, change depends very much on the one hand, ideas that we generate from time to time in various spheres. Now, for instance, as he rightly said, the social sciences have, played a major part And then, of course, the education system is a vehicle that we can use to take some of these ideas to the younger generation, and then through the younger generation, basically come up with, let's say, a citizenship that would, basically respond to some of these positive ideas. So I do not want to go on and on, but I think Tudor has presented a very comprehensive, very thought-provoking, and also, of course, very stimulating paper. And I'm quite sure this will open up a very vibrant discussion, and I'm quite sure towards the end we might be able to crystallize some of these ideas that he touched on towards the end of his presentation. So we have a very good group of panelists. I don't have to really say that they are a very eminent group of panelists, and I do not know in what order that well, maybe we can start from this end, Radhika, and then of course, Pan. Yeah, I think we can go. I think you know the time limit. We have been given 10 minutes each, so yeah.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I speak to you really today in my capacity as the former director of the International Center for Ethnic Studies, not in any capacity that I hold now. I want to thank Tudor for a very thoughtful and very comprehensive paper. And I want to say a few words about the tension between ethnicity and development, insights I got while working at the International Center for Ethnic Studies. When I initially told my brother, who was seated here, I was going to be the director of the ICS, he was very skeptical. He said, if you can't eat it, wear it, or sleep under it, what is its relevance? He was a true development economist. Kumari Jayawardena, one of my mentors, was even worse. She said, ethnicity? She said, an ethnic center? Are you sure it's not a CIA plot? She asked me. But after 1983, she embraced the term. And as you know, SSA did one of its pioneering work on ethnicity and social change. But I think, essentially, for most of the audience here, there is a causality in terms of economics and ethnicity. Economics comes first. I think for everybody in the room, except perhaps, and the ethnicity and all those ideas, and even I think Professor Hettige's remarks, are superstructure. They are manifestations of the economic base. But it was Max Weber who introduced the idea of ethnicity, which he said is defined by a subjective belief in their descent, ethnic groups. And he held that as autonomous and independent from the economy. Now, after World War II, there's been an era of identity politics and ethnicity. But as Professor De Silva clearly outlines, the negative role of ethnicity in Sri Lanka. And he's focused mainly on the Sri Lankan state, but we know of the other kind of ethnic violence that's been there. In his paper, which I read first, he was very concerned about extremist violence. And his main thrust was that we must tame ethnicity. But with regard to violent extremism, I think we have to separate it from ethnicity. A framework for violent extremism must be built around the criminal law. And it must be political violence, not only ethnicity, leads to extremist violence. So the tension between criminal law and civil rights are the framework for understanding extremism. A Pulitzer Prize-nominated book by Carla Powers called Homeland and Security does a survey around the world of all the efforts made to fight extremist violence. And she found the best way to deal with it was not through torture or anything like that, but through mentorship, of having mentors in constant touch with young men. So I think that is the mindset we must put on to deal with extremist violence. or political violence, because as you know, in Sri Lanka, we are faced with political violence as well. We must be targeted. We can't just dump everything under ethnicity. Secondly, ethnicity by itself need not be tamed. It can be a rich and very tapestry full of cultures. Now, I've been doing a little history reading since I have a little free time in my retired. All the great cities of the past were very ethnically diverse. I'm now reading a book on Alexandria in ancient Egypt and Greece. They're the best and most brilliant minds from every ethnic group. They invited the Jews, they invited Buddhists, everybody to come and settle. They were at Constantinople and Herat, which was the center of civilization during the Samarkand era. All of them were cosmopolitan and full of diverse ethnic groups, and they made huge leap forwards in terms of science and technology. So ethnicity by itself is not something we should worry about. But it is based, it can only work if there is a culture of mutual tolerance. And that Professor De Silva has pointed out how we can do that. And one way of doing that is to remember Benedict Anderson's work, that the way you get into people's minds with nationalism or whatever is through primarily the education system and through the media. Those must be used to develop a framework of tolerance and mutual respect. Otherwise, this glory of ethnicity, especially in the cities, will not survive. It will result in violence. But the basic question we face is really, how does a society deal effectively with difference? Difference with regard to ethnic groups or difference generally. And there are societies that forcibly assimilate groups, but the democratic option has been spelt out by the great philosophers of ethnicity and pluralism and multiculturalism, Charles Taylor and Will Kimpler. And their argument is that an individual, this whole individualism of the West, is not particularly useful, that individuals, they say, are really realized, the majority of them, through their community. To respect individuals, you must recognize and respect their communities. And it was their theories that led to all the policies of multiculturalism, pluralism, all in the 1990s. Immigration in the West has now blunted that philosophy, but for the need, and there's now a need for a bottom line like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But it was a recognition of multiculturalism in the 1990s. So let me just sort of end by saying the two issues that face ethnic groups, especially minority ethnic groups, I'm going to talk about, is the issue of equality and difference. On the one hand, ethnic groups want to enjoy political, civil, economic rights on equal terms, especially language rights in Sri Lanka. And I think at this level of our development, we're ready to grant that. I think every single political party in Sri Lanka is ready for that framework. But what they also want, which we're not ready to give, is special recognition for certain things. Now, for example, I've met some Muslim women from France, and they insisted on wearing the veil or every time because France was stopping them from wearing the veil. So like an act of resistance, they now wore the veil, while in Iran they're trying to overthrow the veil. So this notion that they want special recognition of their group, and the personal laws of Sri Lanka as an example. The Muslim groups want that recognized. So that one. The second special recognition in Sri Lanka is they want political arrangements that recognize what's going on in the areas that are where they live in the majority. And that is the real sticking point with regard to the Tamil issue. Majorities are deeply hesitant and fearful of this kind of special political arrangements, and hence our dilemma and conflict in Sri Lanka. And this was true in Quebec, in Canada over Quebec. But I think the Canadian Supreme Court judgment on Quebec is the most wise. It said there are no black and white solutions. There must be dialogue and discussion Any resolution must be negotiated, no unilateral action. Any arrangement must be undergirded by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that was their judgment on the Quebec question. And I think that is good guidance with regard to that aspect where a minority wants special political arrangements with regard to being majority in the areas in which they live. So that is the political dilemma we face, the fight for equality on the one hand and the fight for special recognition. The first, the majority is very willing to give. The second, they're very hesitant. So I'll just...
We will have all the panelists to make their contributions, and then we can open the floor for discussion. Next, we have Professor Dhammika Hera from Peradeniya University to make his.
So, good evening, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. I should also mention that this is a comprehensive paper by Professor Tudor Silva, and perhaps you might be undergoing a few more revisions before it is finalized. So, some of the things that are said here might help you in broadening the scope, perhaps. So, coming from the academia, let me also take a few insights from some of the pioneering works on ethnicity, as Dr. Radhika also did. Now, Professor Tudor speaks about taming ethnicity, and how do we do that? Well, I'm going to cite two of the pioneers in the field of ethnic studies. One is Ernest Gellner, who said nationalism tries to make culture and polity congruent, to endow the culture with its own political roof, and not more than one roof at that. So, yet, as argued by another pioneer in the field, Renan, he showed us a weak point in ethnicity, and also basically in nationalism, not ethnicity. He said, I quote, forgetfulness, and I shall even say, historical error form an essential factor in the creation of nations. Thus it is that the progress of historical studies may often be dangerous to nationality. So certainly historical studies like the one that Professor Silva has done can contribute to take the ground beneath nationalism. We as academics and researchers can attack the very foundation of nationalism, that is the Achilles heel of nationalist discourses, and try to unravel this historical error, within quotes, historical error which Renan also spoke about. This can involve, as Professor Silva mentioned, reforming school curriculums, civil society, coffee shop type of discussions, like what happened in Europe, the political discussions. Now in Sri Lanka, we have been given the impression that politics is dirty and politics is bad. So many people try to avoid politics, but some of the great European philosophers had a different idea. I mean, they said coffee shops in Europe, these are places where people came and had coffee or anything else, and had political discussions. And that contributed to building a vibrant democracy or democracies in Europe, which also enhance their development. So this is something that we should also do. We encourage people to talk politics and also engage in politics, because the view that politics is dirty has been given to us by dirty people, not that politics is inherently dirty. Professor Tudor also speaks about weaning away extremist elements in all communities in his paper. This is an important point, but a very difficult and a sensitive project, I would say, and we need to discuss how we go about doing that. Is it by moving towards a common education system without resorting to religion or religion-based education? I mean, here I would like to cite one interview which we had. Professor Tudor was leading this study. We interviewed a Richmondite from Gaul. He was a successful businessman, and although he was from Richmond school, he couldn't get his son into the school because he was a Muslim. So now we know that there are people who talk about madrasas and how inimical they can be for peace building. But then have we not introduced quotas, limiting the entry of minorities into some of the main streams? I shouldn't be using mainstream school, but anyway, the city schools. So how do we bring about intermingling of people belonging to different ethnicities? In some of the schools, the percentage of non-Buddhists, for example, can be only 1%. I know in my school, there are some of my friends who couldn't get their children admitted to the school that they went, even through the Old Boys Association, because they belong to a different religion. So how do we, so this is something that Professor Tudor can look. How do we bring about this integration then? Can we create a sense of security for everyone, where the need for extremism or ethno-religious congregation of people become useless? So creating a sense of security where as a father, as a mother, one doesn't have to fear about the security of one's child or one's business entity. And that feeling of security and stability is necessary for social stability and economic justice. So how do we do that? And certainly bringing together a sense of stability and security for everyone is not only a social asset, but also a economic asset. So now coming back to, I hope I'm within my time still. So a degree of taming ethnicity is probably necessary. Maybe not the word, but we can discuss. But I think from what it means, it can be necessary. From the angle of securing the contribution of all communities towards developing a common Sri Lankan identity and building an inclusive growth that encompasses all communities. So this is what Professor Tudor argues, and this can be interpreted by different stakeholders in different ways. But a positive evaluation of it could mean, while ethnic identities are preserved for social and cultural reasons, an overarching identity can be constructed for political and economic reasons. Professor Tudor quite rightly points out that ethno-religious diversity is a positive outcome of Sri Lanka's long history, and this diversity is a social and economic asset, leaving us with a beautiful culture and an economy driven by creative people from different communities who perform various and different activities for the economy. And let me also take maybe 2 minutes if I have. Is that okay? Okay, yeah. Now, one of the interesting things in this paper is the attention on micro level impact with cascading influences. And there's already rich knowledge on the economic destruction of the 26 years of war. But sociological insights such as what happened in this Mnuangoda factory and how it had cascading influence, I think this is something interesting. And also how the technology has changed. Now, Benedict Anderson spoke about print capitalism. How much have we gone beyond that now? And how the modalities of contemporary xenophobic movements have changed or got upgraded, as it were, from the modalities used in anti-Muslim riots in the 1950s and anti-Tamil riots in the 1980s and other riots, and of course the latest anti-Muslim riots within the last decades or so, and how they have used modern technology as a modality for organizing people, for coordination and for attacks, and this is highlighted in Prof. Tudor Silva's paper. I think this is also an interesting thing. Finally, one thing that Prof. Tudor Silva might also want to speak is that if you remember the study that you led, where you was also part in the North and East about maybe couple of years ago, from a development perspective, how the so-called outcasts communities in Jaffna were complaining about lack of development for them, and how they were being, yes, I'm just finishing in 30 seconds, how they were being denied opportunities, and also how the opening of the economy at the end of the war had also positive and also negative impact, like the intense competition from the south and how it impacted on prospects of having a livelihood for the farmers in the north and so on. So probably this is something that you might want to focus in your later revisions. But let me end by congratulating Professor Tudor Silva for his insightful paper, and I look forward to see a final revision of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dhammika. I think we have now the third speaker, Rian Senrathe from UNDP. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor. I would not use the podium. I have not prepared a speech as such. But let me first congratulate Professor Tudor for this very insightful paper which is presented to us today. And it dwells into the historical trajectory of ethnicization of development in Sri Lanka very well, and also marks certain recent dilemmas that we have faced in the country over religious violence, outbreak of religious violence. But I will not use my academic hat here. I will take off my academic hat and I will wear my practitioner's hat and talk a little bit about uneven development in Sri Lanka, and how ethnicization of development has crept in to the development trajectory overall. So I will, in this light, would like to mention, very recently, UNDP rolled out the first ever multi-dimensional vulnerability index in Sri Lanka with a national representative sample of 25,000. There are some of the key pen holders and advocates who have been part of that initiative here with us today. So in that, what we witnessed was the geographical unevenness of development in Sri Lanka. So what we witnessed further was, when you look at the geographies, areas like Ampara, Mullaitivu, Kilnochchi, Batiklo, Nuwara, Puttalam, over 65% of the population were considered as the most vulnerable population of the country. This says a lot to us. What does it say? it says like, the most marginalized minorities of this country live in these areas, including Nuwara. So we still are struggling to come out of poverty and other aspects that makes people vulnerable in these areas, and ethnicization of the issue comes very salient in that respect. So what are the from what we have witnessed so far, what are the reasons to which this is happening? I think we also did a recent study with Marga Institute, a series of language audits in these districts, where we found out access to services, access to public services, and also access to skills development required for population to come out of poverty and come out of difficulties in their own geographies has become an issue. So, language has been, national language policy has been there now in Sri Lanka for decades, but still we are struggling to overcome the issue of mainstreaming the national language policy in Sri Lanka, and it's affecting the development process of these geographies in particular. Then the second one, what we have witnessed was I'm also working on resettlement and reintegration related interventions. So there are about 16,000 refugees still to return to their former dwellings after the conflict. And there are about another 8,000 odd individuals who are still internally displaced after 14 years of war, who are still struggling to find their way in their own hometowns. So they still do not have access to land, they still do not have access to better livelihood opportunities. So all of this tantamounts to their current conditions in these particular regions. So we are I think when you look at ethnicity and development, I think we need to realize some of these issues, post-conflict legacies issues that we are facing needs to be addressed in this context. So that is another thing that we have identified. So other things that we have also done a study on how economic reintegration, regional economic integration comes to the forefront of ensuring people's access to opportunities. So as I think in the paper also, Prof. Tudor has mentioned, has observed that the importance of integrating the post-war communities to the economy as a key obstacle, that is affecting their development process. So we have also witnessed there's, even though resettlement has taken shape over the last 14 years, and it has been quite successful in terms of the process, still we are struggling to overcome the process of ensuring access to economic opportunities for the communities in the northeastern and also the areas that I mentioned earlier on. So these are some of the key issues, salient issues that are affecting the uneven development that is occurring in particular areas where ethnic minorities are calling as their traditional homelands. So I think these are some of the things I think would be of interest to examine further, because I don't think it has been examined in the current context. That needs to be examined further in a research piece like this as well. Then I think Professor mentioned the issue of violent extremism and the issue of hate speech. I think, sir, you made a few references to that. I think I work on these two topics at UNDP, And violent extremism in particular is not only resulted by economic or uneven development processes as such. So there are other, like, when you look at violent extremism, there's, there are certain push and pull factors that are affecting violent extremism for people to take arms, people to become violent. So along with economic development aspects of it, there are other issues such as sense of belongingness, ideological shifts, then also the importance of psychosocial support, particularly in a post-war conflict situation, psychosocial support that needs to be accessible to the people who have been affected by decades of war and violence in this country. So these are some of the issues that we still have not grappled with that effectively. There's a cohort of ex-combatants, disabled ex-combatants, war widows, women-headed households who have been affected by decades of war, who are still struggling to overcome their worst nightmares coming true on a daily basis. But these are not addressed. I mean, these have not been addressed. So I think, there's a requirement when you look at the process of development and de-ethnicization of development, that we look into these aspects as well. Finally, I would also say, the role of the private sector and the diaspora. In order to de-ethnicize development, there's a huge role the private sector and the diaspora community can play in a country who's struggling to come out of an economic crisis. Creating that level of access, demand-driven access to opportunities for youth in these areas where deprivation and uncertainty prevails is critically important. And this is something that I think, in the recommendations, I think Professor Tudor can also look into how the private sector and the diaspora communities in Sri Lanka and outside Sri Lanka can play a pivotal role in transforming the development trajectory in the mostly conflict-affected areas of this country. So with that, I will conclude. I thank you, Professor, for providing me with this opportunity, and congratulate you again for this excellent paper. Thank you.
Okay, we have Mario Gomez.
Thank you very much for the invitation to the Gamini Korea Foundation and the Innovators Forum. It's a pleasure to be here. I have a few comments for Tudor as he revises his paper, and then also a few comments of my own. I think Tudor presents a range of interesting ideas on the links between ethnic conflict and economic growth. I think he presents a particularly strong case on impunity and how the ethnic pogroms occurred with very little accountability. I think we all know that impunity has been a problem in Sri Lanka for many years, both with regard to the ethnic war, but also with regard to pogroms, ethnic pogroms, where no one has really been held accountable for their crimes in looting and destroying businesses. I agree with Tudor that singular Buddhist nationalism has been a key driver of state policy over the years, and this has had disastrous consequences, I think, for Sri Lanka. Tudor also makes a very important point about the high level of military spending, even after the end of the war. Reading Tudor's paper, to me, one of the important questions is this. At the time of independence, Sri Lanka had perhaps the second highest GDP next to Japan in Asia. Why did we lag behind? Why did we fail? As the rest of Asia, the East Asian tigers in a way, just zoomed, and Sri Lanka fell behind. Where we were once the model for Singaporeans, it has now become the other way around. And Tudor presents it differently when he talks about the foundation being there at the time of independence, but Sri Lanka really not grasping its potential that it had at independence. Now, Tudor offers many explanations, and I want to put one more explanation or one more idea into the pot, And that's the question of constitutional government. From the 1970s, we've had a very centralized system of constitutional government. We had power being centralized in a very strong parliament and a cabinet of ministers in the early 70s. And then in 1978, J.R.J. introduced a presidential system, and power was concentrated in an executive presidency. Now, the rationale for the 78 constitution, according to J.R.J., was that a strong executive would have political stability to unleash economic growth. That was his main argument. The executive must be free from the whims of parliament to be able to unleash economic growth and development. But J.R.J. has been proved horribly wrong, I think, in these past 45 years, because we've had some of the worst political violence this country has seen for years. We had the ethnic war, we had the JVP violence, and we've had ethnic attacks on Muslims and Christians over the years. So where he prophesied stability, we instead witnessed huge amounts of instability and political violence. So to me, I think it's time to discard the executive presidency. It has proved to be quite flawed. It has not provided the framework for governance that we require. And I think we need a more balanced form of government with balanced checks and or rather checks and balances amongst the three different organs of government and the independent institutions. Now, having said this, I want to also put forward another proposition that I think constitutions have a limited role to play in driving economic growth. They can provide a framework for transparent governance, maybe robust institutions, maybe ways of questioning government policy, but even the most democratic constitution alone will not drive economic growth without accompanying economic policy that is effective. I think the paradox of the 1978 Constitution was that while it introduced a very anti-democratic feature through the presidency, it also introduced fundamental rights, which are quite important. So you had this anti-democratic tendency coupled with a very democratic tendency, the whole fundamental rights jurisdiction, which in the recent past has proved to be quite interesting in the way the court has interpreted the accountability of the previous regime, interpreted the negligence of Sirisena during the Easter bombings, and recently we've had some good judgments on the plural nature of Sri Lankan society. Now, moving on to Tudor's paper specifically, I just have a few comments. I know it's not possible to take on board everything because of limitations of space. But I was wondering, Tudor, whether it's worth reflecting on the Rajapaksa experiment with infrastructure development soon after the end of the war. So after the end of the war, there was an attempt to try and erase ethnicity almost by going in with these huge infrastructure development projects. I think it started in the East even before the end of the war. And to me, the failure of that really illustrates the relevance of ethnicity in Sri Lanka's case. That you cannot just parachute into a region, build bridges, build ports, and so on, without some understanding of the particularities of that region, perhaps what communities want, what their understanding of well-being and the good life is, and just have a top-down model of development. And to me, the sort of Rajapaksa experiment, I'm no economist, kind of illustrates the relevance of ethnicity in sort of Sri Lanka's development model. And now that's happening in Mannar. Many of you must be aware of the sort of battles around the wind power project, around titanium mining, and so on. And so there's another parallel that's happening on that coast. The other question is, of course, the role the Burghers played in Sri Lanka. And the language policy of the 1950s had implications for the Burghers. And they left in droves in the 1960s and 70s because they were quite upset with the language policies. And I think the Burghers provided a certain layer to our ethnic mix. Michael Roberts, or I think Percy Collington has called them the people in between. And I'm wondering whether it's also worth reflecting on the role the Burghers played whether it was in art, in politics, in the military, in economics, and so on, as professionals, and whether that can also be integrated into your paper. In your PowerPoint presentation, you mentioned Kohli's study on the East Asian model and its relevance to Brazil and Nigeria, although I don't think you discuss it in your fuller paper. And that led me to reflect on two other country contexts. One is Malaysia, and the other is Singapore, both of which have experienced high levels of development over the years. And I'll start with Malaysia because it's a diverse society like Sri Lanka. The Malay Muslims, the Chinese, the Indians, people in Sabah and Sarawak, and so on. They've also adopted the Bumiputra policy as an attempt to respond to the British rule. Now, like Sri Lanka, Malaysia also experienced political patronage, corruption, and all the negative features of Sri Lankan society. But they still managed to grow the economy. They have a social mobility for all classes, even if it was unequal. And so I'm wondering whether you might want to reflect on that. Here was a multi-ethnic, diverse society with corruption, with patronage, and so on, but still managed to unleash some level of economic development and make the benefits available to its population. I mean, similarly, Singapore, again, a diverse population, and it managed to grow, hugely over an extremely short period of time. And I think Singapore has really two lessons for us, even though it's fairly controlled society. One was it managed to control ethnic relations fairly harmoniously. The second was the way it managed state-owned enterprises. And I know that's also one of the topics for the Innovators Forum. Clearly, the state-owned enterprises has bled the economy. It's become a sort of refuge for the cronies of those in power. And I think the other thing they also managed, both Singapore and Malaysia, quite well, was that they put a lid on the race riots. I think Malaysia had its worst race riot in 1969, but since then there have not really been any ethnic riots in sort of Malaysia. And I think your paper really highlights how periodically governments have actually facilitated ethnic riots against minorities. Finally, I'll just comment a bit on your wish list. So you speak about taming ethnicity. I would rather talk about celebrating diversity rather than taming ethnicity. Let us recognize that we've been diverse, influenced by all sorts of currents for centuries, and let us try to celebrate this ethnic, religious, and other forms of diversity rather than try to suppress it. I just want to add two things, Mr. Chair, before I close, so his sort of ways of transforming ethnicity. One is, I wonder whether we can also talk about connections among different ethnic groups. Focus on shared cultural spaces. So, if you talk about Adams Peak, Kataragama, St. Anthony's, Kochikade, people of all religions and ethnicities are sort of worship at those sites. Can we highlight stories like that? If you look at early Sri Lankan cinema, it was driven by Tamil business people. One of the early pioneers of Sri Lankan cinema was a Bora. So can we talk about those stories where there were connections across ethnicities, across different groups, as a way of also contesting the more negative implications of ethnicity? And finally, on history education, you mentioned that in your paper. Can we also try to build inclusive and plural histories, talk about histories that don't get told? If you look at our history curriculum, it kind of stops at 1956. Is there a way of teaching contemporary history to school kids, and also through other forms like the media, like television, documentaries, and so on? Thank you once again for a very rich paper. I think it has a lot of potential, and you can certainly take it forward in very many ways. Thanks once again.
Thank you, Mario. I think we have had a very interesting responses from our panelists, and I'm not going to really preempt any discussion on these things right now. But I think we may want to open the floor now for discussion of the paper, and also of course you can comment on the comments made by our panelists. And I think we have about maybe half an hour, and then we will have the last 15 minutes to give our presenter to respond to the panelists as well as the others. Thank you. We'll take a few questions, and then we can ask.
Yeah, you're open for questions. You may introduce yourself and ask questions, please.
I'm Shanta Dasgundatna from Tilokris Global Solutions. This question goes to the panelists in general. I just want to know whether is there any impact from the colonialism and the consequences of colonialism towards the ethnic disharmony in Sri Lanka.
Any more questions so that the panelists can answer at once?
I'm Maharaj Kiriyalla. I just want to, I saw that in your presentation that the law enforcement, but I think the legal system in Sri Lanka, whether it was addressed, because in the common law of the Sri Lanka is the Roman Dutch law, then we have the English principles on the commercial law, and also we have the personal laws. So that again makes a lot of segregation. So if we are talking about the harmony, so that's also an area that need to be looked into, specifically into when we are talking about the economic harmony, also whether the legal system is in right place, right? So those are my concerns.
Thank you very much. I'm going to make a comment, if I may, rather than a question. First, I'd like to thank Professor Silva in particular and also the panelists for extremely valuable insights. Certainly this is an area I'm not very familiar with, and it's been a massively educative experience for me to be here. The point I'd like to make as we're talking about ethnicity and development is my kind of headline message is the 83 events fundamentally derailed our development strategy. Now, why do I say that? President J.R. Jayawardena, when he liberalized the economy, one of his main slogans was export or perish. So the idea was that we have export-led development, export-led transformation, which many countries, particularly in Asia, have been able to successfully implement. Very early in the piece, the GCEC, the previous incarnation of the BOI, set out to attract investment into the electronic sector. There were two firms, what was it? I think Harris Corporation and Motorola, who actually decided to locate in Sri Lanka, two American firms. Shortly after that, they started to implement the installation of their capacity. We had the 83 riots. And the project manager of one of those firms actually was killed during the riots. So they basically shut up shop and migrated to Penang. If you look at what has happened in the electronic sector in Penang, you will see what an opportunity we lost. So that's one dimension. The second dimension is, Mr. Dimel, I think, who is being laid to rest now at the moment almost, was very keen to get Japanese investment in the early 80s to give substance to this strategy that Mr. Jayawardena had initiated. Japan was giving us a lot of foreign aid, but no investment. He went to Japan many times. Finally, the Japanese ambassador came and told him, Japan has decided to choose Sri Lanka as one of 4 countries where they're going to have a major shift of foreign investment. Because the G7 countries at that time forced Japan to revalue the yen. And so because Japan had very large trade surpluses with those countries. So they got them, Japan decided to export capital instead of goods. And there were 4 countries. It was Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Sri Lanka was the 4th. Now I remember the Japanese ambassador, because I was a junior note taker at the meeting, Japanese ambassador at the door turned around to the minister, to Minister Dimel, and said, Mr. Minister, this is now your chance. And a few months later, the Japanese brought 34 investors, potential investors to come here. We had also been told that the Japanese would not invest before Japanese banks came here. That was their strategy. Banks would come and then the FDI would come. And the Japanese ambassador told Mr. Dimel, 2 banks, Bank of Tokyo and Mitsubishi Bank, which have now merged, would be applying for licenses, and he asked the minister to get Governor Rasaputra, who was then the central bank governor, to expedite the approval of those licenses. So all this was in place. Then 34 people came, and on the day, there was a big event organized at somewhere around here at BMICH. The event started. At 10:30 it was abandoned, and the Japanese investors were rushed back to the Oberoi where they were staying, and they saw Peta burning from the Oberoi. They got on a plane and went, and we've had no Japanese investment at all. And if you look, again, if you want to understand how much we've lost, you need to look at what happened in Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia at that time. So you just see the growth and development trajectory in all 3 of those countries shift up in the 80s. So that's another massive opportunity that we lost. So in my view, you can trace a line from the 83 riots through to our massive crisis that we've had. Because we really, once you open up your economy, you have to go for export-led transformation. And we did not do that. Of course, there was an anti-export bias in our policy mix as well. So it was not all down to the 83 events. But this was a major kind of implication of the 83 disruptions, because it completely stymied that whole strategy that was being initiated. So we missed a massive opportunity. Thank you.
Maybe we may take one more, and then we can...
2 more maybe?
Yeah.
Okay.
One.
Good evening, sir. Thank you very much for your informative presentation, as well as comments from panelists. I am Captain Sumut from Sri Lankan Navy. I have one question, and before that I'll give a small introduction about the last panelist mentioned about Singapore and Malaysia, as well as I mentioned Indonesia. I would like to comment on Indonesia aspect, because in Sri Lanka we have very limited races, but in Indonesia, as I know, it's more than 1,300 ethnicities, 300 languages, more than 300 languages they are talking. The 1945 constitution, they made the nationalism as first, as well as they created the Panchasila, five pillars of concept. After that, they developed, as I mentioned, since 1950. It started from 1945 to, if we see it, to 2023, how they developed. It's we cannot think how they did it, because of the even they created one language called Bahasa Indonesia in 1945, because they speak more than 300 languages. With that, can we think that ethnicity as a development blocker, or it's a development successor? Thank you, sir.
Thank you for the presentation, Professor. Just a quick question. I think we had this conversation in 2022, where you developed a questionnaire, a tool, which Marg also used, part of the questionnaire, where we looked at how different ethnicities look at the other, how minorities look at themselves and look at the majority, and how majority look at themselves and the minority. I think it's a very interesting, very opportune study. At that time, you did a pilot in, I think, Peradeniya area. Have you been able to pursue that, and would you like to elaborate on that, Professor? I think it would be interesting for this forum.
Okay, we can actually now, respond to some of the questions and comments. Maybe we can.
Thank you very much. I think, first of all, I must thank you all for your comments and suggestions. Very useful. I will immediately respond to some of the questions that came from the audience. With regard to the question that Amar raised, yes, actually we tried to develop a questionnaire to monitor, the perceptions in different ethnic groups against each other, and we translated it into Sinhala and Tamil, and we used it as an online survey. Actually, I started with my students, like a personal interview, and then administered it on a larger group. What we found was that, in many countries there are multiple surveys on ethnicity, diversity, religion, almost on a monthly basis. But in our country, unfortunately, we don't have any such. So that we don't know exactly what is happening, whether there is improvement or whether there is a kind of deterioration of attitudes over the years. So we have used that information basically to educate the university students about what is going on and what they can do to basically overcome the issue. And we find that actually, Peradeniya University is a very multi-ethnic establishment, where we have students from the north, students from the south, students from center, and we have multiple media, Sinhala, English and Tamil. But we also find that there is a lot of segregation. Students don't interact. Students from the north rarely interact with students from the south. Even Tamil medium students, there is a big distinction between ethnic Tamil students and Muslim students. They rarely interact with each other. So that this is one of the reasons why I thought maybe we should tackle this problem at least initially within the education system. And maybe through education, through possible interventions in the textbook preparation, and maybe interactive learning, in the field, students going to one community and then discuss their observations is probably one way to overcome. But we haven't, right now, university system has zero money for research. In the economic crisis, we only have money to pay salaries. And also big chunk of it is taken back in the form of new taxes. So life is very difficult, and research tradition has been very badly affected because of that scenario. And thank you very much for your comments about Indonesia. I think that's a very useful experience. I think we know quite a bit about Indonesia and Malaysia, like Mario has mentioned, but don't know much about Indonesia. I think in each of these countries, my initial argument was that we have handled ethnicity very badly of all different countries. And in all these countries, in Malaysia, I think it's a good example. They had the initial tension, initially targeting Chinese and then other communities. And then there was mass violence. But they learned a lesson from it. And then they were able to stop it at some point. I think Bhumiputra ideology came, and then they established this UMNO, as a multi-ethnic kind of political formation, and that helped them to address the issue through various interventions. So at least they have learned the lesson, and we don't seem to have learned the lesson. And this is why this kind of dialogue is very, very important. And also, Dr. Kumarasamy, your point about post-83 developments is really interesting, because you come from a first-hand experience about that era, and you know how it basically discouraged investments, international investments from this country. I think we need to document it clearly. I don't know whether I can do it in this paper, but maybe I will approach you and we can have a chat and see how we can probably bring it into a paper. Thank you very much. And your question was about... well, that's a good question. Actually, I haven't addressed it in much in this paper. And colonialism is, like during the colonial period, there were many impact on ethnicity. They divide and rule was, of course, one approach they used, and new ethnicities introduced. Burghers were one such. There were many ways in which the colonial policies actually contributed to further ethnicization of society. They started, especially in the population censuses, they introduced the ethnic categories, and that perhaps in some ways reified or reinforced existing divisions. So these are some negative aspects, but also in the colonial period, they also, tried to, especially in archaeology, history, they tried to bring out the shared heritage of, not necessarily the ruling elite, but researchers who work on it. So we had to look at both aspects of it. But I think it's very, very important to look at the colonial period and its impact on ethnic polarization in society, without blaming them.
You want to respond to any others? No. Okay. Any of the panelists want? Yeah.
I just want to say about the colonialism period. It's not only the British colonial powers, but the response of our communities to them that made ethnicity a big issue. With the help of the Theosophists and the Buddhist monks coming forward, Kalinga Besekra has shown how a new Protestant Buddhism emerged, and a very particular identity of Buddhism came. The same in the north. There was this philosopher, the Arumuhanavala, who basically transformed Hinduism and made it, because he was working on the Bible, translating the Bible into Tamil, and then turned against Christianity, and then basically invented a whole Saiva Siddhanta, which is basically what Hindus in Jaffna follow, which is based on Christian structures, like the kind of the church going and the weddings. Even here, Kalinga talks about Buddhist weddings, for example, now only like a sacrament, when earlier it was over 3 to 4 days, people go into the village, various. So colonialism's impact is not only with regard to the census, where they actually created the categories that we now look at each other with. I mean, the early census was 40 categories, and by 1915 they had reduced it to singular Tamil burger. So they played a very important role. The other thing, too, I was just thinking whether you should put majority ethnicity analysis and minority ethnicity analysis in the same frame, because I think they're very different. I think majority ethnicity comes from a sense that this is my land, I inherited it, it must let me be the main figure, everybody is here at my... While for the minority ethnicity, it's a resistance. It's a sign. So I think it may be good to separate majority ethnicity from minority ethnicity.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond quickly to the comment on Indonesia, because I think, despite all the problems we've had with ethnicity, if we had the correct economic policies in place, I think we would have progressed, irrespective of ethnicity and corruption and political patronage and so on. It's just that I think and I'm sure, Indrajit is more competent to sort of comment on this. But had we got our economic governance and economic policies right from the start, despite the problems of ethnicity, I think we would have progressed at least to some extent. I also want to just reflect on Priyan's comment about the private sector, which made me reflect on the number of interesting minority business people there are. Kind of leading minority business people, whether it's in the tea industry, in apparel, in the cinema industry, the pioneers were sort of Tamil business people. So we've had, prominent minority business people play very important economic roles in the private sector. And I think it's worth also trying to do a study of the role and the contribution they have made to Sri Lanka.
One thing in response to Mario, you say if the economic factors were okay, it may not have happened. But what was interesting is the Tamil grievances were not really economic. In fact, the highest physical quality of life next to Colombo was Jaffna. Now, of course, it's the lowest. So I don't know whether even if we had economic growth, the North would not have continued because of the linguistic issue. They wanted devolution. So that was the interesting thing. Very near Colombo, the highest physical quality of life was in Jaffna. So I don't think economic issues were their grievances.
No, just to really reinforce, initially to support Mario, and then maybe to comment on what Radhika said. Mario, you were... Maybe I need to hold it closer. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. Mario, I think you're absolutely right, because I once listened to Mahathir Mohamad explain the Bumiputra policy. He said, Malaysia had some race riots, anti-Chinese riots in the 50s, I think it was. So then UMNO took a decision that they had to make it a big tent and bring the Chinese also into the party, and they realized that they had to have high growth. The way he put it was, we realized we had to get 7-8% growth. Then you take 2 or 3% of that and do the social engineering. And you still have 5-6% for everybody else. That's how we explain the Bumiputra policy. And because they got that 8% growth, it was a pretty stable trajectory. So what you're saying is absolutely right. But I think, Radhika, that point, I think what I'd like to perhaps disagree is that while the North had a very high level of economic and social development, they were losing it. That was the thing. They were on a downward trajectory as the kind of ethnicity factors played into the system. So often it is losing something that creates more of a grievance. And of course, at independence, one can argue very plausibly that the minorities had a disproportionate share of the cake, particularly the Tamils. So once they started losing that position, clearly there would be a grievance. So though the level of development was relatively high, it was on a downward trend, and that, I think, created some clearly disappointment, and in the end, protest. Yeah.
I think you have been raising your hand for a while. Yeah, please.
Yes. So I feel slightly at a disadvantage. I'm not an economist. I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a public intellectual in that sense. I'm just what you might call a dental epidemiologist. Just to introduce myself, I was a senior professor and dean of the Faculty of Dental Science in the University of Peradeniya before I retired. I don't know whether at 79, it's something, my hearing is not as sharp as it used to be. So I was just checking with my wife whether I had heard properly. But I was somewhat surprised that we've been going on for 2 hours. And nowhere have we heard reference to the fact that perhaps the panacea to all the ills surrounding ethnic discord, chaos in this country, is to have a secular society. I would have thought that we might have talked a little bit about secular society, even though it's a very explosive thing to get into. I was recently writing an article in Colombo Telegraph, and I spelled out what a secular society would imply in Sri Lanka, the complete separation of governance from religion. The governance would be carried out by people qualified to do that, and religion, whatever the religion, and religious leaders would get about the business of transforming people's lives and preparing them for the afterlife, whatever form that state of bliss might be interpreted in the different religions. And I feel that perhaps when you look at the myriads of things that constitute ethnic discord, chaos, violence, and misery in this country over the last 70 years, all the main stumbling block to getting rid of much of that is the fact that we are not a secular society. And conversely, wouldn't the panel agree that if we could only become a secular society, even though I don't believe that will happen in another 1,000 years, that many of the stumbling blocks to ethnic discord would be removed. Thank you.
Okay.
Are we going to take any more questions, Professor? Or I think.
Well, I mean, we can take a couple of more because I think we can spend another 5 minutes or so.
Hello, my name is Shudipta Roy, and I'm a research fellow at Georgetown University. And as a Bangladeshi American, I was kind of hesitant to raise my hand and ask the questions, but I had to, because I think one of the ideas that came across as a possible solution is replacing ethnicity with nationalism, And I think we have not, if I understood correctly, please correct me wrong if I'm wrong. And unfortunately, I have not read your paper, and I just received it. I'll read it. But if that is one of the suggestions, then I am a bit uncomfortable with that idea, because in Bangladesh we are seeing how nationalism is encroaching upon the ethnicity, and some of the indigenous populations are losing their lands, But I don't think when you were talking about nationalism, you were talking about nationalism based on ethnicity, right? You may be talking about nationalism which is a civic nationalism. And I think that difference is very important to be made in the paper, if it is not already done, of course. We have the German model of nationalism, which is based in ethnicity, and we have the Anglo-French version of nationalism, which then after the World War II spread all over the world with UN's mandate and everything. But as we are seeing in the current contemporary world, the same ethnic model of nationalism is coming back, with the populism being on the rise. And even in the South Asian context, the cricket matches, right, are very national, that the pride is so high. And after so much hate is spewed after each and every cricket match. So I think maybe nationalism may not be the right approach, to replace ethnicity. If we are even thinking about ethnicity, we may think about much more of a civic model of global nationalism or global citizenship or something of that sort. Might be something to think about. Thank you.
I think we can probably take the remaining time for him to say whatever final words, and then maybe give me also 5 minutes to bring the whole session to a close in a reasonable manner. Yeah.
Thank you, Silvi. I'm not going to give the final word on ethnicity and development. Actually, the final comment. Okay. For me, this has been a very useful learning experience, because I think there are a lot of aspects that we need to go into that I have not actually included in my paper. My paper was presented as a working draft, and I'm planning to, improve it and maybe make a final submission. To start with, Dr. Roy, your comment about civic nationalism versus ethno-nationalism, I think it's a very important point. What are the connections between ethnicity, ethno-nationalism, and then civic nationalism? I think what I propose is a kind of civic nationalism, but I know, as you rightly said, that even in the US, there is a resurgence of ethnic and racial identities as outcome of the current situation. So it's a, the distinction between ethnicity and race is also somewhat problematic, because there's a lot of overlap between the two. So we need to look at those, and in my final paper I will try to refine the terminology used, but I think this will be a good starting point. And I think what we can learn from these various inputs is that also my good friend Professor Ekanaika brought up the issue of, you also mentioned about, what is the word you use? Secular system as against non-secular. Secular society, yes. Actually, there is a question whether there is a secular society anywhere in the world, not only in Sri Lanka, even in other countries. They often try to bring in religion and religious sentiments and ethnic sentiments, racial sentiments to address issues. But I think the problem here is to what extent the state remains a neutral partner. State is able to mediate between different groups of population, and to what extent state is trusted by different communities is what is important. I agree with you. Our state is not secular, not pure secular state, and it has actually the infiltration of religion has increased over the years. I mean, not only because of the constitutional provision for Buddhism, what is the terminology we use? Special foremost place, in the country. That is only one aspect, but there are many, how politicians have actually, mobilized religious groups, from time to time to get support and to basically survive in the political system is important. To what extent this can be controlled through legal interventions is something we need to explore further. And I agree with your point that perhaps the issue is dealing with diversity. How best we can deal with diversity, and to what extent diversity should be recognized and incorporated. But I use the word taming to basically argue that ethnicity has overdetermined. Like a salience of ethnicity has become too much of a problem for a country like Sri Lanka to handle. So we can celebrate diversity, but people should not get carried away with kind of over attachment to their ethnicity. And in my view, actually, if you look at the Sri Lankan history, we have not been like that, and we have been a fairly inclusive society. I mean, people have interacted, and I think many panelists also mentioned about, collaboration among different religions, syncretism, and that has been, shared nature of our culture and history is quite important. I think this purification of or effort to purify one's race or one's ethnicity is a new development, and that is connected with violence, extremist violence that our colleague from UNDP also mentioned. I think with this I will stop. I'm very happy that we started talking about ethnicity, and like the whole objective of this session, I think, was to break silence about ethnicity and be able to talk about it from different viewpoints, and I believe it has happened to some extent.
2 minutes. No, I just want to say that I was involved with the negotiations with Dr. Neelan Tirucholum on secularism in the early stages in the 1990s, and there was such pushback from the Buddhist lobby that even the TULF and everybody gave in. They were willing to make Buddhism the foremost religion because you can't go ahead after that. And I can't let my brother get the last word. I must say that the Chinese minority in Malaysia and in Indonesia is a city-bound immigrant kind of minority, and the Jaffna Tamil is a territorial minority with a very different. So I think the Southeast model for Sri Lanka may not have worked. I just want to say that.
Okay. Maybe I come there.
Yes, Prof. Yeah.
You want? Well, I want to make use of the last 5 minutes, and I hope you will bear with me. I want to actually, highlight certain things that came up that did not necessarily receive adequate attention, and I think that we probably have to bear in mind as we move forward. I think this whole issue of colonialism, I think, someone mentioned about the census, and I looked at the 1971 census and the categorization of different communities. And there was a huge list. But as you can imagine, as late as we move forward, we have been reducing it to fewer and fewer categories, and we ended up with what we have now. So in other words, I don't want to say anything more on that. I think the point is, in the first census in 1871, the people were given the opportunity to say who they were. Who are you? How would you identify yourself? But whereas as we moved further down the line, we have been basically sort of saying, giving people a few options to say, look, I belong to this. And so anyway, that's not a very, I'm not saying that that's the only story around it, but anyway, that's. And the other point is about, uneven development, I think is very important. And that has been the pattern over the last 4 decades. In Sri Lanka, I don't have to tell you, the first 3 decades, we adopted certain policies that were more equitable in terms of, let's say, land distribution, access to education, and then access to, other opportunities and so on and so forth. Rural-urban disparities were contained. I remember, our Marga Institute, they published this book, in 1974, I think, urban-rural balance that was maintained, and so on and so forth. So the point is, it's not only unequal distribution in terms of regions identified as minority areas and so on, but also in terms of, other disparities. And that, I think, basically contributed to, this kind of polarization. It was possible because, naturally, the state had already become ethnicized. And then, of course, we also had ethnicization of, so many other institutions as well. And then, of course, we have this whole debate about secularization. I think this secularization debate did not take root in Sri Lanka. I remember, the first, debate in South Asia, it was led by C. Dubey, Indian, and they had actually a major conference in Moscow, and that was published. I have the book with me at home. So the point is that debate continued in India and in some of the other countries, but whereas in Sri Lanka, it just died down, and it did not, recover at all. Now the question, of course, is not secularization of society that I'm talking about. Actually, it is secularization of the state and secularization of education. And we failed in all three. Of course, you can understand if the society was not secularized, because it is not possible. But on the other hand, it can remain part of the diversity, and the diversity can be celebrated. In fact, that is what is happening in many parts of the world, as you can see, in terms of food, in terms of arts, in terms of dress, in terms of public culture. So the point is that it's a matter for celebration and enjoyment rather than a matter for hating the other kind of thing. Anyway, and then the other question is what happened to education. I think that's the most important, I would say, because in the formative years, if you do not allow people to have an open mind and grow up, both in terms of thinking and also action, and also relating to people and so on and so forth. In Sri Lanka, we failed to, we have segregated education system for the last 50 years on religion as well as on language. Now, we have the most monolingual communities in this country. I mean, most of the, if you take I would say that some communities are even more trilingual. I don't want to name, but the point is that we have created monolingual communities. Like take, for instance, the university system, and we have a huge problem. We do not know which language to use when we have a mixed audience. We have no chance, and so the point is that it has become a crisis, and so on. And then we have this whole issue of the balance between different worldviews. Science and religion. I'm engaged in a small study right now in the University of Colombo. You see the balance between science and religion. Science is a perspective, a worldview, and religion also provides. And then the point is that these two have to be balanced. And in Sri Lanka, we fail miserably. And I think that is really one of the major issues that we have. And then about ethnic Malaysia, I have to say something. Because unlike here in Sri Lanka, we had to establish a Center for Ethnic Studies. You call it a Center for Ethnic, outside, the state framework. Whereas in Malaysia, it became part of the National University of Malaysia. In fact, one of my friends became the first director. I think our mutual friend, Samsul Amri Baharuddin. The point is, they recognized the need to manage it at a state level, not at a community level. So the point is, Samsul, I have been in touch with him on these lines, and they have been basically doing so much to really provide the necessary guidance to public policy making. And here, we have not been able to do that, and you have been trying your best at ethnic studies, but the point is, it's not like having, accepted it as part of the state framework and so on. I think, let me see, I think I have probably covered everything that I felt I should be touching on. So maybe I think we have so much to digest. I think Tudor has a big job to do, and I think Tudor will do it, and I think this paper would be, fairly good, for us to look at when it is revised and updated. And I think we can look forward to having not so much further discussion, but figure out how to really move forward. And I think we have come to a point where this is really very critical. I think we are at a turning point. We are at a crossroads, I would say. And I think this is the moment for us to really take this as a challenge and actually inject this whole perspective that we have, I'm coming from all of you and of course our panelists, into the public policy process. I think if you don't make public policies based on evidence, you will have public policies driven by vested interests on the one hand, and then all kinds of ideologies that are very much disconnected to evidence that we are supposed to generate to feed into the public policy process. Thank you very much, and I have taken 3 minutes actually, more than what I should have, but I'm also one of those people who cannot stop when you start talking. Thank you.
Thank you, Session Chair, Professor Siri Hettige, for moderating this session tonight. And I would like to thank Professor Tudor for his invaluable paper. And I think it has created a lot of thought-provoking discussion today evening. In order to complete today's proceedings, I would like to inform you that the 19th session on energy sector will be on 15th March 2024 by Professor Dr. Tilak Siambalapitiya. So you're all welcome to join that session. And I would like to also thank the panelists, Dr. Radhika Kumaraswamy, Professor Dhammika Herath, Dr. Priyan Sedemiratne, and Dr. Mario Gomez for taking their invaluable time for being here with us and sharing their thoughts with us. And thank you all for participating for today's evening session. Wish you a good evening. Thank you very much. And tea will be served outside, and you're all welcome to join tea. Thank you. Excuse me. Hello. Excuse me. Oh, further.
So we can continue the debate in the class.